Hello. Welcome to Integrating Harm Reduction into the Clinical Setting, Maintaining Connection when Working with Addiction. The key to maintaining connection in this work is compassion. Someone once suggested that radical compassion was needed to support people struggling with addiction, but we don't really need radical compassion. Truly, all that is needed is compassion. Yet there continues to be widespread belief that compassion perpetuates addiction, that compassion is enabling. Unfortunately, the idea of utilizing compassion to help treat addiction is a radical notion. Even more radical for some is the idea of using harm reduction to treat addiction in a clinical setting. How do we get to this place where notions of harm reduction, connection, and compassion for people struggling with substance use disorders is so far-reaching? Momentarily going to make you uncomfortable, but it feels necessary to make a larger point. I'd like you to close your eyes and picture a vulnerable person. Now imagine this person is in a physically abusive relationship. Think about what they might be feeling, what they might be going through. And this person begins reaching out for support. Now imagine clinicians refusing to see this person until they left the relationship. Imagine this person's support network believing that until they hit rock bottom and realize their powerlessness, they stand no chance of getting better. Imagine the legal system requiring they attend a self-help group not run by any professionals as their sole source of guidance and emotional support. Imagine when this person has a black eye or misses work, people roll their eyes and say, when are they going to get their shit together? Imagine this person is told that being in this abusive relationship is indicative of them having a disease and that this condition is chronic. Imagine no one thinks giving this person a place to take a break and recover is reasonable because it would be seen as enabling. Imagine this person dies at the hands of their abuser, and many people in society aren't sad because, well, they did it to themselves. We do this every single day across our country to people living with addiction. This is the only condition in which compassion, care, and support are pathologized and seen as contributing to the diagnosis or even sustaining it. I want to create an army of compassionate and well-informed clinicians, stronger and capable of outnumbering the forces that serve to further stigmatize and harm the population of people struggling with addiction. While our primary goal in this endeavor we're about to embark on together is to increase compassion for our clients struggling with addiction through a harm reduction approach, this is not where we begin. We can't. We have to begin by asking, well, what is addiction? In order to increase compassion, we have to ask, why is this even necessary? And it's a good question. Because overall, we don't have to do a ton of convincing that people with depression or PTSD need compassion. Sure, there's always work to be done, but it's not such a huge problem. Society at large is not against people with PTSD or depression. And the same cannot be said for people struggling with addiction. But why? Why is that the case? Often, it's because we don't really understand why people might be drawn to using substances. But even before we can get that nuanced, we have to go back further and ask, what is addiction? I was convinced that beginning this course with an explanation of what addiction is was the right starting place. But it wasn't connecting, it wasn't flowing, and I was stuck. I was stuck with this feeling that something was missing, that some key point wasn't being explained. And then it clicked. No other diagnosis is so intertwined with the legal system, law enforcement, politics, race, violence, and science. So we can't meaningfully begin to explore addiction without going back to 1914. An important thing to note is that the world's history regarding drugs is vast and complex and certainly relevant. Just the history of opium is so complex and far-reaching it's hard to grasp. Opium was being used in 7th century BC in Assyria. There's evidence that coca use in South America has been around since the 6th century. Breweries can be traced back 6,000 years to ancient Egypt and Babylonia. The long, fascinating tale of drugs in our world is worth knowing. However, for our purposes, we're going to focus on the more recent history of the United States. Prior to 1914, if you wanted drugs, you mostly just went and bought them, right? It's pretty easy. Pharmacies sold all sorts of products that contained opium and cocaine. One of the more popular products was Miss Winslow's Soothing Syrup that was marketed for children as a way to freshen their breath and calm them down, which makes sense since it contained alcohol and morphine. Coca-Cola was being made from extracts of the coca leaf. That is not an urban legend. That is where the coca and Coca-Cola comes from. The cola part of the name comes from the cola nut, which also contained caffeine. In the 1890s, you could even order a syringe and some cocaine from the Sears catalog. And I'm pretty sure if we had remained able to order syringes and cocaine from Sears, they would still be in business. But the Harrison Narcotic Tax Act, enacted in 1914, was a United States federal law that regulated and taxed the production, importation, and distribution of opiates and coca products. The act didn't fully prohibit the use of narcotics. If you had money and connections, you could still get them. However, for other people, notably Black people and immigrants, the new law was increasingly punitive. Yet there was some really relevant leniency. In 1925, the Supreme Court ruled that the Harrison Act did not give the government authority to punish doctors for prescribing heroin to patients already addicted. Then came Prohibition. In 1920, the constitutional amendment prohibiting the sale of alcohol was enacted. And during the 13 years that Prohibition lasted, it gave birth to organized crime in the United States. Murder rates increased during Prohibition. By the year of the repeal, there had been an almost 50% increase. Additionally, many people fell ill or died from purposefully contaminated alcohol meant to prevent diversion. Since ethanol, the only form of alcohol that's safe to consume, became so hard to come by, many people turned to methanol, subsequently getting methanol poisoning. It eventually became clear that Prohibition was not enforceable, and ultimately it was deemed counterproductive. Prohibition came to an end on December 5th, 1933. It took only 13 years to realize that prohibiting alcohol was doing more harm than good, a lesson that would not translate to most other psychoactive substances, and we would watch history not only repeat itself, but double down time and again. A man called Harry Anslinger is largely credited with moving the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from a small, kind of irrelevant agency to creating a movement of getting rid of all drugs and using race and immigration as sources of fear to gather attention and public agreement. Fear tactics such as the cocaine-crazed Negro became commonplace. A Dr. Christopher Cook from Pennsylvania warned, most of the attacks upon white women of the South are the direct result of the cocaine-crazed Negro brain. With regards to marijuana, as it grew in popularity, it became negatively associated with Mexican immigrants and was often called loco weed. Rumors were spread that Mexicans were giving this marijuana menace to unsuspecting school children. Of course, this was unsupported nonsense, but it served its purpose well. Instill fear to get people to support harsh penalties and laws. However, it was Nixon who really changed the course of our views and treatment of drugs when in 1971, he declared the war on drugs and he named drugs public enemy number one. In 1973, he created the DEA, which right now in 2023 is in its 50th year. Half-century mark is a good time for reflection. Where has the war on drugs gotten us? So Nixon proclaimed drugs were public enemy number one. However, it would come to light that this was about improving his political standing. During a 1994 interview, President Nixon's former domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, provided inside information suggesting that the war on drugs campaign had ulterior motives, which mainly involved helping keep Nixon in his job. The interview was published in Harper Magazine and conducted by the esteemed journalist Dan Baum. In the interview, Ehrlichman is quoted as saying that the Nixon campaign had two primary enemies, the anti-war left and black people. Ehrlichman goes on to say, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black people. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news." Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Every president since Nixon, Republican or Democrat, has enacted some form of drug laws while placing little emphasis on treatment and support. Though this is just now beginning to shift. However, the 80s and 90s saw a big push to crack down on drugs, pun intended. 1984, Core Civic opened its first private prison. 66 more opened in the next 6 years. Some critics of prison privatization argue that the use of such a system is unethical because the companies who operate the prisons have a vested interest in maintaining mass incarceration, so they lobby for policies and candidates that will put more people in prison. Then we have 1984, Nancy Reagan launches the Just Say No program, and surveys suggest the Just Say No campaign may have led to a sharp increase in public concern over the drug problem in the U.S. In 1985, the percentage of Americans who saw drug abuse as the nation's number one problem was between 2 and 6%. In 1989, that number had jumped to 64%. Around the same time, Los Angeles Police Chief Daryl Gates founded the DARE drug education program. Gates apparently took a highly unfavorable view of people who used. Gates has actually been quoted as saying casual drug users should be taken out and shot. DARE was adopted nationwide despite the lack of evidence of its effectiveness. In 2001, the Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. David Satcher, called DARE an ineffective primary prevention program. In 1986, Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act and enacted mandatory prison sentencing. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush created the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and the first drug czar was appointed. In the 1990s, Clinton ran on a campaign to push for treatment over incarceration, but he neglected to address the crack sentencing disparity that was 100-1, meaning that 5 grams of crack would reach the same mandatory prison sentencing as 500 grams of cocaine. I want to show you what that looks like. This is 500 grams of cocaine. This is what that represents. And this is 5 grams of crack. Under the sentencing disparity, this would equal the same mandatory 5-year prison sentencing. It would not be until 2010, when Obama was in office, that the sentencing disparity would be addressed, but not fully. It remains a disparity of 18-1. Additionally, Clinton had the opportunity to end the federal ban on syringe service programs, though he did not. In 2005, 4 out of 5 drug arrests were for possession, not sale. 2022, we saw the push for overdose deaths from fentanyl to be considered murder, which of course will reduce the likelihood of overdoses being reported to 911. This push is in direct conflict with Good Samaritan laws that work to prevent the arrest of people for drug offenses, like use or possession of small amounts of drugs, who either overdose or call for medical treatment for someone who has overdosed. As of now, in 2023, 1 in 5 people are locked up for drugs, or 353,000 on any given day. According to the Drug Policy Alliance, who lists the FBI as their source, someone is arrested every 31 seconds for a drug offense, and 85% of those arrests are for possession. It's estimated that the U.S. spends $47 billion every year to enforce drug prohibition.